So do you think China actually wants Taiwan?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping idolises Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
Everything he does in the party and the country. First of all, we've got to get in our heads that carriers aren't designed to go in harm's way. I don't see the Ukrainians getting any of their territory back under current conditions, to tell you the truth. This is new Russia from the 18th century. This is what they want.
A very warm welcome this afternoon, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, Dr. Chris Parry. You joined the Navy a little bit before I joined the Royal Air Force, but we're similar vintage. Really delighted to have you here. Very warm welcome to you today. A whole number of things, largely around maritime naval capability, I want to touch on today. Can I go in a bit of the deep end, though, to start off? The main war, Ukraine, Russia. Ukraine doesn't have a navy anymore, scuttled its ships, and yet it's managed to push Russia out of the Black Sea. It's forced it away using a very effective tactic of using drones and stuff like that. Are there some lessons that the West needs to draw from this about the relative merits of having a significant navy, given what the Ukrainians have been able to do?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think we need to differentiate between a naval capability and a maritime capability. What Ukraine's done very successfully is institute the concept of sea denial. Instead of saying, look, we're going to control the seas, we're going to deny our opponent the free use of it. And that's a very legitimate use of power. They've also managed to establish, of course, the grain shipments in the western side of the Black Sea. Something actually I recommended at the start of the conflict to our current defence establishment. That's been very successful too, because we've got allied nations on that side of the Black Sea. I think technology, of course, has moved forward since perhaps the last generation. But let's not forget the anti-ship missiles being used by the Ukrainians are first generation, second generation Neptune missiles. They're not really sophisticated.
But they took out the Moskva, didn't they?
But the Moskva, of course, if you look at the combat readiness report that's been leaked about them, most of the systems weren't working. Some of the other systems interfered with others. The main surveillance radar, for example, couldn't be worked at the same time as their fire control radars, which is a bit of a downer. And of course, they weren't at action stations or ready at all. And so once the missile and its fuel had penetrated, it just spread throughout the whole of the ship. Very much like Sheffield in many ways, actually, in the Falklands.
But I wonder about that Moskva, because there were lots of rumours going around. I don't know if you'd be able to shed any more light on it. That there were lots of rumours that the Moskva was being manned by a load of people who weren't that well motivated, who were driving the ship round in a racetrack pattern, a thoroughly predictable racetrack pattern. And therefore, if you knew the time of the flight of the Neptune missile, then you wouldn't have to turn any radars on until the last minute. And then at the last minute, you could light up the Moskva, and everybody sort of looks up from their fish and chips and goes, "What?" And in it goes.
Yeah, I mean, complacency. I mean, Moskva basically been unchallenged. They hadn't detected much in the way of electronic transmissions. As I understand it, it was American intelligence that actually led to them seeing the racetrack pattern. They sent a drone out, and that was followed by, I think, 3 missiles, 2 of which struck. I mean, what I think made it worse is you'll see that on each side of Moskva, there are these huge missiles, anti-ship missiles. They're supposed to be carrier killers. I think what happened is that 1 or 2 of the missiles penetrated those missiles, and the fuel actually then seeped into the rest of the ship. And with that, the conflagration was too great, to tell you the truth. But there's an example, start of a conflict. People are complacent. They underestimate their enemy. In fact, the first Ukrainian Neptune battery had actually stood up and had a ceremony on the internet 6 months before. So it's no excuse for the Russians to say they didn't know about it.
Russia, because there's a theme throughout when we've looked at the Air Force side, that the Russians seem to have some pretty capable equipment.
Yeah.
But equipment doesn't equal capability. No. And how much do you think the loss of the Moskva and actually Russia's woes at sea are down to people rather than equipment?
I think it's quite difficult in the Black Sea. The geography of it means that if you've got systems that can actually cover the mileage, then you're going to be able to strike almost anything you want. We've seen submarines and ships attacked alongside with ballistic and cruise missiles. If you're static, there's a real problem. And I think one of the things we're going to have to get used to over the next 5 years at sea and indeed on land is that everything's going to be detectable, either through physical means, your infrared signature, or indeed the data exhaust that you're putting out. So that has real implications, I think. And I think what we're seeing in the Black Sea is that in microcosm. There is no place to hide. So in future, we're going to have to deploy countermeasures to deal with drones, to deal with increasing numbers of capable missiles, but also we're going to have to invest in deceptive electronic technology so we can displace targets away from where the sensors think they are.
I'd love to get into that a bit more, but first, it's how much of this is about people. You know, we in the military that you and I served, we put a lot of time and effort into training our people, motivation, professionalising, and whatever, because we felt it was so important. Things like the Musk, for instance, feels a lot of complacency. It feels it was about a failure of the people, the Russian military. How much do you think that's playing out?
Well, I think, Sean, war. Clausewitz said, war is a human activity, but it doesn't matter how much technology you bring to the fight. The issue is that the amount of human element that you used to have to bring to get the effect you wanted, was much greater in the past. We're in the business now of taking people off the battlefield now. And that's what technology is doing. I mean, today, you wouldn't dream of doing a JP-233 attack on a runway, which at the time looked like suicide.
Operation Certain Death.
Your opponent knows where you're going to go, and also knows what you're going to do.
Knows what height you're going to be, knows roughly what speed you're going to be, knows where you're going to be in a few seconds' time.
Why would you do that? I remember asking that at Marham in 1986, and as an SO2 lieutenant commander, it was almost, that's a career-stopping question. You're not allowed to ask that. Bizarrely, 3 years later, I was responsible for finalising the Defence White Paper every year. And it always went to a civil servant afterwards to do the spell check and grammar check. And I always resented this because, with my background, I thought I was okay with this. But the JP-233 in the end got published as the RAF's runway catering system rather than cratering system and because of this. And there are a number of other things. So we had precision guided musicians instead of munitions in the white paper. And so after that, it ended with me the following year. We didn't pass it to a civil servant, but I always remember the JP-233 because actually, with all the stuff falling out of it, it looked like a catering system.
But the tradition is, you said, and we've seen it on the battlefields. Russia wants to do a grinding war of attrition.
Yeah.
It doesn't really care about the people. But at the maritime domain, where it is all about equipment, it just feels that it's been a bit of a shock to the West.
We're taking people off that battlefield. That's the point.
No, I agree. But you can't. It's difficult to take them off the battlefield in the maritime domain, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I think you've got to.
Although Ukraine has with its drone.
And I think that's the future. I think you're going to find largely very slimly crewed vessels in future. You're going to see essentially motherships with subsystems that are deploying from them. You've seen in the air. You've got the loyal wingman. You're going to see submarines and ships in future with a lot of loyal wingman in the air, under the surface and on the surface in future. The unmanned surface vessels have been very successful in chasing after the Russian fleet and pushing them into the. But all this is foreshadowed, Sean. I think it's a manifestation of what concepts are on the ground in about the last 20 years. I mean, I wrote a book in 2014 called Superhighway. It's not a plug, but I was saying, we're going to see drones coming into maritime warfare. We're going to see directed energy. We're going to see a lot of electronic deception and things like that in future. So essentially, it's conceptualization made flesh. What is interesting about the Ukraine conflict is that on land, it's actually the last war of the 20th century, not the first war of the 21st. And I think when you consider that if you've got enough drones, it doesn't matter how much armor you've got, it's going to die in an environment where you can't bring electronics and microwave weapons or directed energy to bear.
I say, do you think some of this is going to make some of the conventional weapons redundant?
There's always, at any scale of conflict, you can use weapons of any type. But Sean will tell you, you put an F-35 in the air now against, say, first or second generation, say, Argentinian A4s and Mirage, they're going to die. It's as simple as that. There comes a sophistication level at which your dumb munitions or dumb platforms aren't going to work. The fact of life is you need both. Some situations will require large numbers of 155mm rounds. Other situations are going to require sophisticated electronics and deception. I mean, one of the areas I'm exploring right now is what difference space makes. people are ignoring space at the moment in terms of a warfighting domain, and yet it's really coming on fast now as being the big area for surveillance, perhaps even the stationing of weapons in the near future. My business is about looking at what's coming next, and having foreshadowed these things, it's no surprise to me that these things have entered. But the Ukraine war's got this odd feel, as I said, of being partly a 20th century battle, but also a 21st century.
But in a way that it is the Russians fighting the war of attrition. They're bigger, four times the size of the population. Ukraine going, the only chance we've got is to try and find a 21st century. And going back to the drones thing, though, you were writing about this stuff some time ago. I'm just trying to, how does that fit the paradox of knowing that the drone warfare and the ease, the quantity, we're seeing it all across the world, where it's the Hamas firing loads of rockets at Iron Dome, try and saturate it. When you've got something like a UK carrier, several billion pounds worth of capability that we've got, one, okay, it's two, but one at sea at any one time. How on earth do we protect some asset like that that's strategically vital when we know that people are out there with cheap and cheerful that can throw hundreds and thousands? What's...
Well, I think that first of all, we've got to get in our heads that carriers aren't designed to go in harm's way. It's the assets it deploys that are designed to go in harm's way. So we've got to think how that logic projects. I've always thought American strike carriers would never be in the front line. Their amphibious flat tops with the F-35Bs would be in the front line, because I've always believed if units, land, sea or air, are not losable, they're not usable. But the fact of life is, you have a carrier to get you closer to the action when you can't actually deploy land-based stuff or space-based stuff. So let's have a think about the logic of that. If we have to protect our carriers in future, we have to have a way of preventing it getting detected in the first place. And I think a lot of investment in future is going to be going into deceptive measures, electronic camouflage. Electronic displacement is something I'm looking at the moment, whereby any sensor that picks you up immediately gets, in quantum technologies, the image manipulated, thrown back at you, and it's 20 miles away.
But if it's passive, so if it's a TV image guided, it's a passive sensor. So how would you know that it's looking at you?
Well, the fact of life is you'll use space-based and high-altitude sensors. I think what we have to do is get away from thinking about platforms, but systems are the issue. What systems will give you the effect that you want? Now, it's quite interesting. If you go back to the post-Cold War era, just by way of an anecdote, I was captain of our maritime warfare centre, and it was absolutely ridiculous that we had sonars at the time that could probably ping out to about 7,000 yards, and yet submarines would engage you from 7 miles. So why on earth are you pinging through the water? He's watching a film, lining up the torpedoes, and away they go. So what I did is I got together all the surviving convoy captains from World War II. We basically came up with a new concept for anti-submarine warfare, which said, look, don't use surface ships against submarines. Use aircraft and other submarines and helicopters and things like that. And we did 3 anti-submarine exercises, and the submarine couldn't find the main body because everybody was silent.
So why have the submarines not played more of a role in the Black Sea? Because the Russians have some submarines there. They could have, you'd have thought, been able to stop the grain exports on the western side of the... So why have they not been effective? And what happened to all of the... there were some mines laid, weren't there? Sea mines laid. Yeah, it doesn't seem to have stopped the trade route.
Well, in fact, what hasn't happened is these mines haven't been laid in Romania, Bulgaria, Turkish territorial seas. It's illegal. For the same reason, you can't have a submerged submarine in somebody else's territorial seas, so that's kept them away. How
would they know, though? I mean, Russia doesn't normally play by the rules.
No, and we don't either, sure.
No, so,
but the fact of life is, if you've got floating and displaced mines anywhere, you're not putting your submarines there.
No.
It's incredibly dangerous. I mean, 40% of all submarines in World War II were sunk by mines. So even Russian Kilo-class submarine captains know that. The other issue is that they're not that serviceable. And what they've been using their submarines for is for missile firings. So the Caliber missile, which has been striking land targets, comes from the Kilo as well. So they've been using them as missile firing boats. And to tell you the truth, the Black Sea is a pretty hostile environment, as is the Baltic underwater. It's not a really the sound channels that you get there make you very detectable if you're not careful, and the topography doesn't help. So that's why But I think more than anything, the Russians put their investment very much into their nuclear subs, particularly the ballistic missile submarines and hunter killers. I suspect there's a lack of investment there. And of course, they can't punch more units through the Bosphorus because of the Montreux Convention. So I think that's one thing in the Baltic that's quite important, is they have a limited supply of assets that they can use because they can't replenish. You've only got to look at the number of Russian surface and submarine units in the Eastern Mediterranean to see that if they were able to force the straits, they'd be punching them through into the Black Sea.
So also we had, you'll be aware that I think part of the initiative under, I think it's Rishi Sunak, talked about trying to have this maritime coalition to help Ukraine. And they actually started to provide a couple of, they weren't ships, but they were trying to look at how do you provide an enhanced capability for the Ukrainians. None of the announcement mentioned the Montreux Convention.
Yes.
You can't get them in there.
No.
And it was only subsequently. What was the? Do you know much about the background as to why it hit a real fanfare? We're going to help Ukraine. We're going to help them at sea. And you went, nothing they announced is going to be of any use to the Ukrainians until after the war is over.
I think, Sean, there's a lot going on that has not been revealed. I mean, I think the amount of support required to hit Russian warships with unmanned surface vessels is quite substantial. I think Ukraine has got 2 mine hunters, ex-UK mine hunters en route. I don't know whether they're going to be taken over land or something like that to get them there, but they're standing by. But I think quite a lot of maritime support, land-based support, is being provided to the Ukrainians. I don't think that's any secret. A lot of expertise. The whole grain route, I think, has been set up by NATO and implicitly is protected by NATO. Because if you look at the countries through whose territorial seas it routes, and also the ships being used, an attack on those would be very much an attack on a NATO country. So there's all sorts of protections in place. There's lots of expertise. But we shouldn't underestimate just how clever the Ukrainians are in adapting. I think the Americans call it MacGyverism. Is that right? Where you actually use old stuff with new technology.
Well, they're doing that even with the new stuff. I mean, the drones, these kids are watching them get jammed. They're bringing them back and going, right, instead of having GPS, we'll have terrain mapping on there. So we don't need the GPS.
Or steer it visually.
Yeah, and overnight they're adapting them and going in. And that level of adaptation...
And isn't that always the case? The one that adapts the best normally prevails, doesn't it? But mass has a quality all of its own, and the Russians know that. And as you pointed out earlier, Sean, their approaches will throw corpses at it. I've heard Russian generals say that. That's how we'll deal with that problem.
Rather than the danger of asking these questions, we could write a book about it. What's your sort of headline of how you see the Ukraine war playing out over the coming? Let's go up to the US presidential election.
Well, I think you're going to see a series of probing actions by Russia, I think, along the current front line to see if they can actually get a breakthrough. I think by the end of the year, I suspect we're going to be in stalemate, and I think we'll head for negotiations. I don't see the Ukrainians getting any of their territory back under current conditions, to tell you the truth. Unless we have a regime change, and I mean a regime, not a sort of presidential change in Moscow, there's absolutely no chance, I think, of the Ukrainians getting that territory back. There's also a worry I have is on day one of the war, I actually sent a WhatsApp message to Tony Radakin, CDS, saying, you do realise that all Russia really wants is the bottom third. And that's from the Donbass through to Moldova. That cuts Ukraine off from the Black Sea. I actually sent him a picture saying, this is new Russia from the 18th century. This is what they want. They don't want the whole of Ukraine, as it happens.
Do you think there's any realistic... There's lots of talk, wasn't there, 18 months ago, about Odessa being amphibious assault and Russia going in there to do exactly what you've said. It's very difficult to see how Russia would actually be able to do that today.
Well, unless they take Moldova first.
Well, exactly. My point is, how would they do that?
Okay, so you have a coup in Moldova. You've got large numbers of Russians. You've got 20,000, 40,000 Russian troops in Moldova, which aren't being used in Ukraine. And so you've got a series of problems there. If you had a pro-Russian Moldova and you then actually were able to release some resources from some of the other fronts, Odessa looks very, very vulnerable. Now, the only thing in Odessa's favour, of course, it's got probably 5 times as many tunnels as
The labyrinth of tunnels, yeah.
the Massa's got from the Second World War.
Yeah.
And you know, and one of the things I think is really interesting about the Ukraine war as a whole is that underground is the new stealth. People haven't realised that actually underground is where you go when you don't want to be detected. And
But that's not new, is it? I mean, Gibraltar is a network of tunnels, in that.
Trenches essentially.
No, exactly.
Used to be that way.
Yeah.
So I think we've got to pay much more attention to the underground environment in future, both in terms of how we use it and by extension, of course, the underwater environment. Now, what's really interesting about the underwater environment? It's about to become less opaque because of unmanned underwater vehicles and gliders and all sorts of things, which will be cruising the oceans looking for their targets.
But what about the vulnerability? So we talked a little bit before we came in here about undersea cables. Yeah. There was the Nord Stream attack on the gas pipelines.
By the Russians.
Well,
I think.
No, exactly. We all have our views. But how on earth does the world protect itself against some of these arterial capabilities that are networking the whole world that appear incredibly vulnerable?
Well, constant vigilance and investment. I mean, we've taken quite a lot for granted in the past. There's a very good book by Andrew Gordon about the Battle of Jutland, and he says the whole of the 19th century for the Royal Navy was the long, calm lee of Trafalgar. So all the lessons of Trafalgar were progressively forgotten in the sort of dominance that he had. And I jokingly said in a lecture at the US Naval War College recently in Rhode Island, you're in the long, calm lee of Midway. You're still looking for Japanese carriers in the way you're operating. And so I get back to the effect point. What effect with a capital E and small e do we want to have in terms of delivering political objectives and achieving success on the battlefield? And then we work back from that. The biggest problem, Sean, you and I both know, is procurement chugs away, loses sight of the concept and gives you a capability you never intended in the first place. And that's because they don't work back from the effect and keep the effect in mind.
Well, hold that thought for a second. Can I just pick you up on when I asked you about the question about the prospects for Ukraine?
Yeah.
And I think there's a growing body of military analysts who agree with your summary. The challenge, of course, is that what does China take from that when it looks at Taiwan? And without doing a history lesson, the South China Sea is an arterial route for a huge amount of global trade. China's been building artificial islands. It's got its eye on Taiwan. Normally, China plays the long game with these things, but the long game, Taiwan feels as if it's becoming gently more and more autonomous over the years. China was going to want to solve that eventually. What lessons do you think it will have learned from Russia's success in Ukraine? And do you predict China will actually go into Taiwan?
So there's 2 big questions there, Sean. The first is that Ukraine's of a type. It's its own context. We've got to be really careful about drawing lessons from it, either for our own benefit or indeed China's. So the one thing that China's been studying intensively for the last 2 years, as I learnt from my academic colleagues over there, is the Falklands, not Ukraine. So they're learning how it is you take a group of islands that are close to your mainland and stop somebody else coming in and
42 years
intervening.
ago.
Yeah. So if you look at what they're studying, it's the Falklands. So how do you put an exclusion zone around islands and then apply force if you have to get rid of what you want to get rid of? So that's the first thing. Ukraine will have delivered a few technological answers, I think, to various questions, but every context is different. And the nearest one they've got, the one thing about the Chinese is they're really good about adopting best practice in history. They don't care where it comes from. You and I, and I've done it already, quote Clausewitz or Adam Smith, the great works, depending which sector it's in. But the Chinese go for best practice. And what they've picked up as best practice was the Falklands. So we need to see what they've learned from that, I think, in relation to Taiwan. Do I think they'll go for Taiwan? They don't need to at the moment. But we've got to consider Taiwan within the context of the broader strategic framework in the Asia-Pacific. What the Chinese believe is that 11-dash line that they've got, which obtrudes into everybody else's territorial seas, is China with a bit of water on top of it. And that's a fundamental different approach to the way we think about it. So essentially, this is the acquisition of land, not the acquisition of sea. That's how China sees it. And essentially,
is that because the resources underneath it?
It's about the resources. It's about keeping your opponents at bay. It's about actually establishing a trade and tribute network in the Asia Pacific. If they've got it, they will own every other country around there in economic and political terms.
So I think you've answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway. So do you think China actually wants Taiwan?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And Xi Jinping in particular wants it. And I will say to you that China will do something by 2035.
Okay.
That is a significant date. And, I give a prize to anybody who can tell me on this podcast why that is. Okay. Now, Xi Jinping idolizes Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
Everything he does in the party and the country is what Mao did. Even some of his speeches reflect the same words as Mao. So in 2035... Xi Jinping will be the same age as Mao when he died. So I guarantee, in legacy terms, that is a date that he will have in his mind. If you look at all the projections about China becoming a great power by 2049, they've all been brought forward to 2035. The economic plans, everything else.
So the United Nations a couple of days ago stood up and said, we believe that Taiwan is a province of China, according to the 1971 General Assembly of the United Nations, which seems to me in this environment is quite a big, bold thing to say. America's relationship with Taiwan is actually pretty strong. From an economic point of view, despite the fact that there's very little support, open support for Taiwan remaining its own independent country, from an economic point of view, Taiwan dominates the world's semiconductor business. They own 50-60% of the general chip making business. They own 90% of the high end. We're talking about artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, 5G. So the world as a whole is dependent totally on Taiwan, economically and technologically. Now, so what's America and the West going to think of China's ambitions in the way that you put it?
Well, it's a balance. I mean, strategic ambiguity has worked up until now. I think we've got to remember is what is the effect again that we want? We want peace in the Taiwan Straits. So whatever keeps that peace and delivers the economic benefits that you're talking about is what we want. So just as I've been saying recently, if you really want to get the best deal for Palestinians, take Palestine off the table and put Palestinians on the table. In the same way, we've got to take Taiwan off the table and say what's best for Chinese people and what's best for the region and Taiwanese people. And so politically, we've got to go in a different direction. Now, I don't believe China will invade Taiwan. A lot of their procurement seems to be based on being able to dominate the region itself. So if you think about the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, Greater Asian co-prosperity sphere from World War II, that is what they're trying to create for China in that region. And it's basically the same as the Ming Empire in the 15th century. If you look at what was happening there, China had a huge navy, 400 war junks, each probably 7 times the size of the Santa Maria. And they patrolled those waters. And then they turned their back on the sea because they had the threat from the Mongols and built the Great Wall. Last year, Xi Jinping went to see one of his carriers and said, look, this is the century of Chinese maritime power. We are returning to our roots, he said. That's pretty explicit. So what they want to do is dominate the whole region. Taiwan is a key. If you look at Chinese Mandarin speeches, they say Taiwan is the key to the Pacific. And they mean key, as in let's turn the lock.
Yeah.
So for the rest of the world, Taiwan is the key that turns the Pacific,
Japan?
particularly the Americas. Yeah, I mean, we always forget that Japan is nearly 400 islands.
Yeah, and the
stretched down
closest
to the
one
south.
is right down.
And what is the one at
Taiwan's.
the bottom? Taiwan. Yeah, there's all sorts of geopolitical issues that never occur to most people in Europe.
But you also because you talked about the naval part of this. I mean, the South China Sea is actually quite shallow just off the coast. The continental shelf drops away to the east of Taiwan, doesn't it?
Philippine Sea, yeah.
Yeah, if you were to have a submarine base on the eastern side of Taiwan...
Not possible, it's cliffs.
No, but I mean, let's face it, well, they blasted tunnels into...
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
And that actually, because the whole point of nuclear submarines is secrecy. You don't want to see them coming and going type stuff. It feels like it will be a major prize militarily.
It's a great aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point.
Yeah.
And it sticks right in the gut of what they call the first island chain between Japan and down to the Philippines and things like that. I mean, it's incredibly important. But do I think China's going to invade? No, they won't. We've seen already what they're going to do. They're going to blockade it if they have to. But my point is that Taiwan is not the end. It's the means by which they can dominate the East and South China Sea. And my hunch is that if they're able to do that, and this is what the artificial islands are about, is they will then say, any goods that come east of Singapore will either go in Chinese hulls or you pay a toll. It's called a Navigation Act. And where's the best practice for that? Well, it's good old Great Britain in the 17th century who said, if you're taking stuff to America, it either goes in English hulls or you pay a toll. And I think the Chinese have picked up that very important lesson, and that's what they're intending for the greater Asia-Pacific region.
So in effect, they control the trading of Taiwan with the rest of the world.
Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, every other country. And that, again, is what happened in the Ming Empire in the 15th century.
Yeah.
And if you look at the extension of that, the Silk Roads, what are those pipelines, railways and roadways going across Central Asia look like? They look like Silk Roads. And by sea, the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative.
That's what I was fascinated, whether it was because of the maritime control or whether it was because of the resources underneath. I mean, I read some conservative estimates that talked about 11 billion barrels of oil, which was 30 years of our North Sea oil. That was a tiny proportion of the gas that was underneath the South China Sea, and therefore
that's a side benefit, Sean.
Just a side benefit. Okay.
Yeah. This is about strategic space. Remember how many people they've got as well, which is declining. But there's another issue as well. The bulk of the Chinese rely on fish protein, and fish is really important. So the resources of the water column are immeasurably important. One of the first things that's happened on these artificial islands, you've got lots of military stuff there, but most people haven't noticed the fish farms that are there just offshore as well, which they've managed to create. So there's all sorts of, I mean, the one thing I've always said about the Chinese, and I said it in my book in 2014, is they have a joined up maritime military strategic economic strategy. They actually have worked it out. So, for example, all their fishermen are subsidized in terms of their fuel, so that they can go and fish, and they can create presence where they go. You've probably heard about their maritime militia, which is about 400 fishing boats that don't fish. They simply go and park in your offshore zone and become a nuisance.
But
paramilitaries.
Can I use that to segue on to... So I think one of the advantages of China, as you've just mentioned, is they think strategically in terms of timescales. They're not worried about elections and 4-year,
and
5-year...
scope as well.
No, exactly.
Yeah. It's not a single sector issue.
So it feels we're on the cusp of an election in this country at the
Yeah.
moment. There's been... We argued about the peace dividend, but this country seems to have exploited a bit of peace dividend for the last 20 or so years. We used to be a powerful maritime nation. We've got some very capable maritime capability. The aircraft carriers are a very, very potent potential, but we haven't invested in all the stuff around there. There's a lot of talk about 2.5% and stuff like that. Where do you think, given the global threats, we've just been talking about the importance of keeping global trade routes open. We can't afford to be the world's policeman, but where is our role, do you think, as a nation, as part of a coalition, as part of NATO? Where should we be going with our naval maritime capability?
Well, you've heard me say before, Sean, that the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. Now, I think the world is breaking down into two strategic economic blocks. One's the Eurasian autocrats of Russia, China, Iran and North Korea. The other is the maritime democracies, US, Canada, parts of Europe, UK definitely, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and I think within 5 years, India. That leaves a lot of other states with whom we trade in between those two blocks. And they're going to be saying, well, where are our interests in all of this? But the fact of life is, those four autocrats are able to dominate the whole of Eurasia if they choose to do so, and possibly the waters around it. Now, if they're able to take us on the world ocean as well, and deprive us of the routes between commodities, manufacturers and markets, it's all over. And if you look at history, maritime alliances always defeat continental alliances for that reason. Now, if they're able to interdict our ability in that triad, then our economies will collapse and we'll become very dependent on Eurasia itself. So the sea, as well as space, I keep stressing space, If you're not in space, you're not going to be at sea in future in terms of warfighting capability or indeed trading. So we have to say, look, the sea is really important to us and our allies. And I think the free world has to stand up and say, this is an area where we have to maintain the international rules-based system because it operates in our favour. Of course it does. And we have to stop countries like China trying to close down bits of the world ocean, South and East China Sea, Russia, the Arctic, the Baltic and the Black Sea. Even the Houthis are trying to assert a closure of the Red Sea at the moment. So we've got to say we have to have freedom of navigation throughout the world, and if necessary, we need to have the power to enforce it. Now, if you add up all the warships of the free world countries, there's about 1,000 of them, and that easily overmatches anything Russia, China can put to sea. So we've got to get together, whether it's through NATO as the forcing organisation, to say to the free world, if you wish to remain strong at sea, able to trade, able to go anywhere you want at any time you want, then you've got to actually put the investment in terms of attention, in terms of resources and in terms of manpower that's required to do it. If you don't, you will find that the Eurasian autocrats will not only dominate the world island, which is Eurasia, but also the world ocean as well.
But how do we get this message out? Because we're in the middle of election campaigns. People are talking a lot about the war in Ukraine. So we've had our army colleagues going, oh, we need more armies, bigger armies, more tanks, more stuff like that.
Why does the UK need that?
We're a maritime nation.
And we've got the best tank trap in Europe in the Channel.
Correct.
Yeah. So
then we talk about air forces because they say air power, you can't get it involved, whatever. The maritime argument, I'm not hearing it very much. And yet, I'm not a natural Navy guy. But I spent quite a lot of my time at sea. Thank you very much, Royal Navy, and the carrier fleet.
You're better for it.
But honestly, I probably am, because you get a sense of the importance of it. How do we get that message resonating with the public? Because it looks like it's still slow vessels, big, vulnerable, chugging along. Whereas actually what you just articulated, it's a vital part of our global security, not just for us, but our way of life.
Well, it's very simple, Sean. We simply say to people, you know why 6p went on your petrol pumps yesterday? It's because of what the Houthis did. You know, we've got to start translating what's happening at sea into the effects it has on you as an island country. The fact of life is, without the sea, we're going to starve. We can't actually power any of our electricity or anything else. It's as simple as that. And you know, somebody said to me the other day, well, you know, I wouldn't fight for my country, but if my street were under threat, I'd fight. I said, well, actually, isn't it better to fight over there than wait till it comes to your street? And he went, oh, yeah. and I said, it's the same with navies. You know, it's much better we actually go out there and defend stuff and make sure we do it over there rather than the effects of it coming home to us here. And you're absolutely right. You know, I'm a great believer that mass is going to be a thing of the past in warfare. Why? Because everything's going to be detectable and it's all going to be engageable. That's the point. So what we have to do is think how we can apply effect in any environment. And what I'm saying to people right now is forget about numbers of soldiers. Forget about, you know, what it is you want to procure. What effect do you want to have in this context, this strategic context, and invest accordingly? Now, you're absolutely right. Everything is screaming maritime at us. Why? It's because we can go anytime, anywhere we want. We don't have to ask anybody.
Just takes a while to get there, that's all.
Yeah, it does. There's no question, unless you base yourself there.
Yes.
You know, and that's what an offshore base like a carrier gives you, or indeed overseas bases. Absolutely, it takes you a while. But the fact of life is you can get there legally. You know, and Sean, you know, with your background, you know, there's no overflight issue.
No.
And so both the system needs preserving and we need the capability to use that system to our advantage. The problem we've got at the moment is we're allowing people to interdict the system without real consequences. So President Obama very blithely said, I've been promised by Xi Jinping he's not going to fortify the islands. Well, not the islands, the reefs that became artificial islands.
It's like Putin promising that he wasn't going to put these massive troops into Ukraine.
Absolutely. So you've got to challenge them right at the point of delivery. That is the lesson from the 1930s. You know, you challenge them at the point. I was talking when I was a student to a German general who said, you know, what people don't realise is if Britain and France had opposed Hitler during the Czechoslovakian crisis, we in the German army had a plan to overthrow the Nazis.
It would have stopped almost overnight. Yeah.
So these unknown unknowns actually come flooding in on you when you see it.
So with all that then, what should our response be to China?
Our response to China should be robust. What China specialises in, but particularly at sea, is putting a toe across the line.
And watching to see, yeah.
And when that toe is not actually stamped on, it moves the line forward again, and you create a new normal where everyone goes, oh well, it would be provocative or escalatory to push them back at that point. The trouble is, we've basically bred generations of politicians since 1945, probably actually 1959, who are unable to know how to threaten or use force.
Is that because they're scared, or
they're
they don't understand the
inexperienced?
tactics?
They don't have experience of World War II or any other sort of thing. You look at John Foster Dulles and the American officials in the 50s, they were past masters at this. They were able really to sort of negotiate their way through really testy times in the Cold War, a time when Russia, the Soviet Union, would have taken over Europe if it could have done. So,
the Cuban Missile Crisis is a really good example of people just standing toe to toe, but going, we won't put up with this. Yeah. And eventually, I'm not saying it's a great example, but it
is an example.
It is an example.
But the Berlin airlift is a classic one, Sean. They said, do it, we'll shoot your aircraft down. We said, okay, fine.
Bring it on.
Yeah, bring it on. And unfortunately, we've got a situation now where one of the most stupid things that I hear is force can only be used as a last resort. Well, great. That is a signal to our opponents to actually push the line forward as far as you can. Yeah. I remember when Ukraine was invaded in 2014, I was on Radio 4 with, I'm going to say it, William Hague. And basically, I was being asked about my views, and I was saying, right, there are 3 US warships in the Black Sea right now. They need to go and sit right off Sevastopol, okay, within sight of everybody, saying we have an interest here now. And William Hague was saying, oh, no, you can't say that. It's escalatory. And I'm saying, no, we should also raise the NATO alert state. And he said, no. In these circumstances, all we can do is diplomatic and economic pressure. There's no military input. I said, you have just given Putin a green light to do what he wants. Yeah. That is typical in my mind of how inept our politicians are in relation to statecraft.
They're managers, not politicians.
Well, I'd sack them if they were my managers.
Look at Obama. You mentioned Obama. So
Obama,
the threat to Syria, if you go and kill your own people with chemical weapons... Yeah. You're over the red line. What happened? Nothing.
Iran, JCPOA, we'll settle now, but you can have one in 12 years' time if you want. Oh, that's in 3 years' time. So how are we dealing with that? So China's the same. He basically appeased them. The biggest problem we've got, guys, today is we've got appeasing politicians whose only interest is electoral politics, not statesmanship. Yeah. Last one we had, Margaret Thatcher. Simple as that. Yeah. Who said, look, there is a country issue here now. No, I mean, one of the best lessons that I learnt about how this plays is after the Falklands, some of us were invited to go and have lunch with Margaret Thatcher. And during the pudding course, I got to sit next to her, and I thought, well, what on earth am I going to ask her? And as a 28-year-old, obviously I was in awe of the handbag more than anything else. I said to her, what did you learn from the war? Which I thought was a fairly reasonable question. And she said, well, you tell me what you learnt first. And I said, well, I learnt I could do it. And that was my big lesson. She said, what I learnt from the war is that we as politicians have to tell the military people what our political objectives are, not interfere with the military objectives. All I want my military leaders to do is deliver my political objectives. Now, I would say, Sean, in our experience, what war since the Falklands that Britain's been involved in have the political objectives been articulated to the military? And there's Afghanistan, there's Iraq, there's
the tragedy was the Afghanistan. We will end up doing a podcast on that.
But where were the political objectives? In fact, in Afghanistan, the 3 corners of strategy, where were the political outcomes, where were the resources, and where were the military means? All 3 legs of the strategic triad were lacking. So, of course, it was a failure.
Can I just...
End of rant.
Yeah, no, it was a good rant. The other one I just want to pick up on, you mentioned the Houthis and the Red Sea. It is interesting to see how basically a bunch of Houthi rebels, bluntly, without a navy at all, being supplied by Iran, are able to have such a strategic impact in the Red Sea, notwithstanding, obviously, they're just opposite a very narrow part of the Red Sea. My point being is, isn't it time we put sort of like convoy protection in, like we used to in the Second World War? It does feel, as we're coming on air, I think last night another merchant ship was attacked 3 times, taking in water. We think it's going to get itself to port. But, isn't there more can be done? It feels like we're very vulnerable.
I mean, to be fair, that's what they've been doing. They've been grouping up ships and, obviously putting warships with them to protect them as they go through. It's all about risk. I mean, if the commercial operators don't want to put them through, they want to put them past the Cape, then and all the additional costs, that's fine. I think what it emphasises, Sean, is the fact we've got choke points, geographic choke points. Strait Gibraltar's the same, English Channel, Baltic, and you can actually impact the maritime sphere from the land. In the past, remember, territorial seas were governed by the range of a cannon out to 3 miles. And I'm jokingly been saying recently that actually that's been extended to 200 miles because of drones and also cruise missiles that you can fire out to there. So your level of control is now possibly out to 200 miles. In my book, again, in 2014, I pointed out that anybody that can project power and induce effect at sea from wherever it comes is actually demonstrating sea power. Pirates off Somalia are demonstrating sea power if you don't put something in to oppose them. And again, it's sea denial. That's what the Houthis are doing. But again, we've got to really analyse what's going on here. The Houthis say they're supporting Gaza. No, they're not. They're trying to assert themselves as a faction in Yemen and also trying to show the Iranians they're good value for money.
And do you think Iran is actually controlling those?
They're giving them intelligence. People say, they're proxies for Iran. The Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas are not really proxies. They're fellow travellers and allies. I mean, the Gazans might say they're useful idiots as well now because of the way it's gone. But the fact of life is they have a common agenda, which is, they say, anti-Western, and it is the continuing revolution in Iran. The regime itself is under considerable pressure right now. There's a leadership contest. Khomeini will die soon. There'll be a succession crisis. 75% of the population's under 35. That's only going one way. Yeah. So they're projecting outwards now all their internal problems. And add to that, they've just lost their president in a helicopter crash. So there's all sorts of issues in Iran.
UN put their mast at half.
Yeah. Oh, don't tell me about that.
Mourned his loss.
Yeah, but the Houthis are very local. They were attacking shipping in 2016. People forget this. And that was basically to offset what the Saudis were doing and the UAE were doing to them in the war there. So that's always their expression of an internal problem for them.
So back to your thing about let's get the strategy right as opposed to trying to fix each individual bit. So
the effect.
Quite.
That's the thing.
So if you're Britain, the West, the US, and you're looking at what's happening in the Middle East, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran. Overall, what should we be doing to counteract the long-term negative effect of that?
We've got to maintain the international system that operates in our favour, whether it's at sea or in the region. What we need to do there, I think, is encourage the Abraham Accords, which we're actually doing quite nicely. And one of the reasons, I think, for the Hamas proxy attack, which was a proxy attack, was to disrupt those accords, not just... I think there was also an opportunity issue as well. I think Hamas possibly jumped the gun in terms of when they attacked. They saw this Nova festival going on over the border. I thought we'll have that.
Not heard that before.
I suspect they jumped...
Well, it's also Yahya Sinwar is actually on record as saying he didn't expect Israel to respond the way they did.
I was going to say, really?
No, but it's easy to say in hindsight. But we both studied a bit of history. If you look at the number of times these things happen, Israel responds, international community settles down.
7th of October is off the scale in terms of what has happened in the past. I mean, you can't unsee the videos if you've seen them, and I don't want anybody to see them.
Have you seen them?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you cannot unsee them if you've seen them. I can tell you there's real potential for trauma if you watch those videos.
Yeah. Nikki Haley was in Israel giving a talk in the last couple of days, and she orally, they didn't play the videos, but she orally described them.
Oh no!
I couldn't take my eyes off it. I found it very, very distressing.
It is appalling, and I wish I hadn't seen them. The fact of life is that if you're an Israeli, that's multiplied in emotional terms. And I keep saying to people, don't expect the Israelis to be totally logical in what they're doing at the moment, because there's a heavy layer of emotion here, and I can understand that. And we're on the same scale of betrayal as Pearl Harbor, 9/11, things like that, in terms of strategic impact, which is why you've got such a huge reaction to it. But I seriously believe that the Iranians would have preferred a coordinated attack with Hamas and Hezbollah.
Okay.
As a means of actually doing that.
To avoid getting into that particular vortex, one thing I would like to just bring us out. We've been talking throughout this about global threats around the world, and it feels like a more dangerous world, whether it is or not, but it feels like a more dangerous world than it has been for quite some time.
It is, Sean, there's no question.
It is. And therefore there's a question about increasing defence spending, which is in this, and we're on the cusp of a general election. One of the key announcements that's been made over the last few days is about national service.
Yeah.
I haven't met any military who can see value in that. Our military, serving military, are not allowed to comment at the moment because everything is in purdah. There's a note on the record by Permanent Undersecretary that said, literally the day after the election was announced, saying this is
We're not going to do it.
What's your take on all of this?
Well, I'll be interested in the military input on this, Sean, and who's actually giving advice. We haven't seen any of the detail yet. All I would say in this forum is that unless it enhances our military capability and gives us a better reach back into our society in the event of total war, then it's a waste of time and money. I think people haven't worked out the detail. They haven't worked out the number of instructors required. We can't even train our own people at the moment, let alone these additional people. I hear that it's never going to be more than 30,000 a year coming into the armed forces, but we can't cope with that.
So by numbers, so the British Army is about 80,000. They recruit about 10,000 a year. So they have a training system that copes with 10,000 a year.
Yeah.
And those training, they then gain experience, they get promoted, then they come back and help.
Yeah.
So there's a return on your investment.
Yeah.
We're going now, rather than 10,000 put in, they're going to have an extra 30,000.
Yeah.
And none of those 30,000 are going to return to help feed the fight.
Well, they might join. But my worry is it's a gap year.
It's four times the capacity.
Yeah.
Who's going to accommodate them?
Yeah,
Where's the dental service?
Yeah,
Where's the medical?
No, there's no detail, Sean.
There's one good thing happened, by chance. It obliterated the airways for about 2 days. The Labour never got a chance to speak.
The fact of life is, my view is there are better ways of actually doing this. A simple solution to quite a lot of our problems is when you leave the service, we say to you, look, we'll give you 2,000 a year. We want you to give you 2 weeks training. You just stay in the job you left in. So if you're a principal warfare officer at sea, or indeed you're a Typhoon pilot, just stay on the books, okay? Just be a reservist, and if we need you, you will come back and do that job. It's very simple. That's how you do it. I wrote the paper 20 years ago when I was in the service. That's how you actually do this. You say, let's retain the skills we've got. Just give them a little bit of money. Sean, you probably remember we had the Royal Naval Air Branch, which was Fleet Air Arm guys who were flying for commercial airlines, who came back and flew Harriers helicopters in the summer holidays. And these are the guys we used, to supplement in crisis. We should be doing the same with doctors, dentists, all these people. There are much better ways of doing this. You look at the Norwegian model, it takes a totally different type of society, as it does amongst the Danes and Swedes and Finns, to actually institute this. Their societies set up more differently. Where I think what we could do is say, look, come and serve for a year in the armed forces. It becomes essentially a on-job training issue, like an internship. So come to sea with me. You will do stuff with my sailors. You will learn how to do this. If you like it, that's fine. You'll be actually supplementing what we've got. That's good too. Much better way of doing it. It looks like a press gang, but I think it will work.
People might join up.
Yeah, but I mean, traditionally, the reason that most of our senior military have never been for this is that generally you're not as well motivated if you're pressing people to be part of the military. Therefore, you compromise
volunteers
professionalism. But I agree. But if you compromise professionalism, the model they used was they said the Swedish model. It works over there, and you went, First of all, they tend to be more a neutral country. They don't go overtly. So you create a bigger pool of people from which you can draw reservists. But we have a lot of dependencies around the world which we have to fight for. We also send our Army, Navy and Air Force off on campaigns, Afghanistan, etc. If we have a less professional service, we're going to pay for that.
But it's worse than that, Sean. They're actually saying you're not going to fight. You're not going to fight if you come in. You're not going abroad.
That's where the detail is.
So you know, it's really interesting. So you know, I was privileged a while ago to talk to Michael Caine. Michael Caine was a national serviceman who was fighting for his life in Korea. You know, as an 18, 19-year-old. So are we talking about that sort of person? No, we're not. We're talking about somebody who's coming to do essentially what is an internship and a gap year, who's going to contribute very little to our fighting capability. And that should be the criterion. Here's the money this end. How much fighting capability do we get out of this at the other? If the answer's nothing, that's a waste of money. And frankly, we've got better things to do training, as you say, training our own people than training people who simply are on a gap year. You know?
Just as a civilian on that one, given they've got, the individuals have got a choice, so they're not going to be press ganged. A lot of people, if it ever happened, it's probably unlikely given the way the election process is going. I think a lot of people would choose the community service as a gap year. Those who did opt for the military, as you suggested, a proportion of those might join up. So, maybe, I hate to give politicians credit because I think half of them are stupid. And the other half, sort of don't tell the truth. But, maybe there is something in it that we can't yet see.
Okay, so let's look at effect again. Give me $2.5 billion, right? And I'll invest more in basically university air squadrons, university RN units, CCFs, and basically the territorials.
Okay.
I bet you I can produce more fighting capability by doing that.
Yeah, there's one problem. One problem. You sound like a guy who knows what he's talking about. You're just not in the system.
That's why I didn't survive to the top. Neither did Sean. Yeah, they don't want people like us.
It's a real shame, actually, because...
You want people who are going to minimise the inconvenience for politicians.
I think the tension between the military and the managers, the bureaucrats, the politicians, and, say, take the NHS... So I've supplied to the NHS and the military. One of the problems, I don't want to get us onto the NHS, but one of the problems with the NHS, it's now run by managers.
Yeah.
And it's
not
become
by professionals.
Not by professionals. And it's become a bureaucracy. And the problem with bureaucracies is they love to have very fat middles, and it just gets fatter and fatter and fatter.
But let me give you an example, okay? I got my PPL at 18, right? I was flying a Hunter out of Broady by 21. Did I want to fly? Yeah. Seriously. So what age do you have to be to fly a jet now, do you reckon?
Well, it's not
26?
an age, the age you end up doing it because of the long system.
Yeah. Well, that's my point.
Yeah, it just takes ages. But I got a private pilot's license at 16 because I got one of these special flying award things. But the time it took to get through training then...
Yeah, and that's my point. If you can actually invest at the front end to that extent...
Get them in.
Yeah, get them in, get them serving, get them going through. 2.5 billion? God, I could transform our armed forces with that. And you front load it. It's as simple as that. I've heard this week that we're finally going back to formal... in-person interviews to get to be an officer in the Royal Navy. They've been virtual up until now. And there's this ridiculous story recently where somebody got to the end of training and said, I didn't realise I had to go to sea.
Well, there was that story, wasn't there, as well? They said that the Royal Navy was dropping the requirements to be able to swim. And of course, nobody actually looked beyond the detail and went, hang on a minute. What they actually said was, we will train you to swim because,
And Sean, Nelson's Navy, probably 95% couldn't swim, which is why they all drowned.
No, exactly.
So that's no big deal. And let's face it, are we actually saying we're going to put you in an operational situation where you're going to have to swim?
Exactly.
No, you're going to stay on the ship.
No, exactly.
so no, it's fatuous to tell the truth.
No, exactly.
But Yeah.
I'll take us back to something else we touched on earlier. So something has been irritating me over the last few months.
Only one thing.
Yeah, well,
lots
actually
of things.
lots. Yeah, but this one in particular, I've got to sort of be in my bonnet about it, which is that we've got an unelected Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, who keeps on standing up and making pronouncements. I don't like much of the things he said. I don't like it because I didn't vote for him, so there's very little accountability. The other day, he stood up and said, so the war with Ukraine, we've done actually pretty well, haven't we? We've depleted the Russian capability. We've not lost any lives. So it's good value for money, isn't it, really? Meanwhile, Ukraine has lost a huge amount economically, geographically, in terms of their forces as well. And my question is, it might be true, but was it wise for David Cameron to actually stand up and say, when it hasn't cost us anything apart from having a whole load of kit, and Sean will say that a lot of it was old anyway, was it wise to stand up and say, actually it was good value for money, this war?
Well, I don't hold a candle for David Cameron. I mean, he started the depletion of our armed forces with the 2010 Strategic Defence and Security Review. I actually wrote a scathing criticism of it in the Daily Telegraph at the time. So he's no friend of us. It was not wise at all. He's absolutely right, though.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the way the Americans have invested 5% probably of their defence budget to deplete 75% of the Russian capability, I think it's great value for money.
And that the money going around in circles.
Yeah, it's
realpolitik,
but, you know, again, I get back to my point. We need statesmen. We don't not want people who come out with cheap lines like that and give everything away. In fact, we're getting far too much given away at the moment about what we do. I mean, we had a German general saying that the Brits had people on the ground in Ukraine. I mean, one of the things we do need to consider is we need to start drawing in security in the same way we had it during the Cold War now. The amount of stuff that is out there is absolutely ridiculous. And dare I say it, we need to start punishing people if they get caught. I saw yesterday that they cut the cables, the data cables to Leonardo up in Edinburgh, some sort of protest group. Well, that's sabotage. And we should treat them as saboteurs, not as peace campaigners or whatever. We've got to start getting really serious about this. You know, I look back at my own career during the Cold War, regular security lectures, you know, these are the things to look out for. This is how careful you have to be. You know, we had a senior official leave top secret documents at a bus station a few years ago. You know, he's back on the gravy train again. That should have been career ending. You know, we've got to start taking this seriously. The bad guys are seriously wanting to do us harm right now. And unless the British public and even the armed forces get that, we're not going to prevail. And I find it quite dispiriting that the idea of producing political fighting capability is subordinated to all sorts of other agendas at the moment within our armed forces. And I'll be perfectly explicit about this. I'm a great supporter of diversity of thinking, neurodiversity. But having diversity for its own sake, numerous academic studies tell you that diversity for its own sake does not produce better fighting capability. Diversity is a means, not an end in itself. And I'm afraid to say diversity in all its forms, all its surrenders and appeasements at the moment, is proving is a barrier to fighting capability. I don't mind saying that.
In industry, it's created division.
Oh, of course.
Actually. So it's the opposite of the second bit of diversity, which is inclusion.
I have to say, this will be controversial, but if you've got a good leadership structure, you don't need a DEI section. No. Because of course you're going to be inclusive.
Anyway.
You know, you'll employ diverse talent where you find it, and you want equal outcomes for good people. So, you know, to my mind, if you've got a massive DEI organisation, your leadership's at fault. There's no question about that. That's very controversial, but I believe it to be right.